We talked about the milking cow management during our previous lecture, so the lactating cow, and now we move on to the dry cow. And on each of these three components, we'll be talking about nutrition, housing, and animal welfare in detail during future lectures. Right, so why should we really dry animals? Wouldn't it be more profitable to milk them throughout the year instead of having a 60-day dry period? Why not get milk throughout, right? So just think about that for a second. Um, Animals or even machines cannot work throughout 24/7. Right? They need a rest. That's a simple explanation here also. The mammary gland, right, which changes into these alveoli for secreting milk, they need a rest, right? And so this is what the histology would look like during the dry period, resting, non-lactating, and this is what mammary glands would look like during the lactation phase, right? So this is the dry period that we are talking about here, 305 days of lactation and approximately 60 days of dry period. So how do you get this 60 days? Is it the optimum, or is it just something done for ease of management? Right, so in theory, remember how these 60 days comes because of the natural seasonal annual seasons. Animals are pregnant for uh, 285 days or 290 days, so every spring they calve, so that period happens to be about 80 odd days. So the natural dry cycle would be something like 80 days, and then but in daily management we go on to make them for 305 days because it has been shown that cows' milk production is optimum around this period. See, so this is the yield difference. This is in pounds and kilos in brackets. So this is compared to the herd average, right? So if you have cows dried for 50 to 60 days, they give 135 more kilos compared to the herd average, and in the subsequent lactation, and if it's 60 to 70, slightly more, right? This is why this is the typical dry period practice these days. However, so this is actually not a very new publication, it's a pretty old one. However, physiology remains the same, but the practice is that they try to stick to a 60-day dry period for heifers, but for multiparous cows, the dry period has been significantly shortened, maybe 45 to 50 days, for two reasons. One is that you get more milk. The longer you milk, you get more milk. So that would be like, instead of 305 days, that would be additional 15 days, right? So 320 day lactation. The other reason is so modern cows give a lot of milk, and even at the time of drying off, they are still producing a lot of milk. So what they recommend is so when you milk them for these extra couple of weeks, the daily milk yield gradually goes down. That makes it easier for you to dry them off, right? So although that is the theory behind this, you see, there are some cows that get very short dry period, some cows that get a very long dry period, but majority of animals are dried off somewhere around here, 50 to 75 days. The majority of cows are dried off. In Canada, in Sri Lanka, I'm presuming the chart shifts to the right side. But then again, there are certain practices where they don't give a dry period at all. they lactate throughout until the next calving. So some of these farmers don't understand the biology or the physiology behind this. So this is the same thing as earlier, deviation from the herd-made milk average in the subsequent lactation, depending on how much of a dry period you give them. See, from 50 to 70, it's almost the same, right? But 60 is like the peak optimal. This is a relatively new publication from Purdue University. Right, now there are basically two drying off methods, right? One is abrupt cessation. That means you just do everything as routine every day, and suddenly, 305 days happen and you dry the animal off, right? And the next one is intermittent milking, right? So this is not a sudden abrupt cessation. This is a gradual cessation. Right, so if you might be milking animals twice or thrice a day, and in this case you are milking, shift to once a day milking during the last 1 to 2 weeks of that 305-day lactation, depending on the production level. So if it's a very high producing animal, you would start this process 2 weeks prior to 305 days. If it's a moderately high producing animal, you might start this just 1 week prior to drying off 305 days. And again, depending on the level of production, you may or may not impose feed restriction. I'll talk about that shortly. Right. Right. So now, which animals do you think are a good contender for abrupt cessation, right? So ideally, animals that are naturally, physiologically drying themselves off, the milk production has increased. Right? Some farms go on to dry animals if the daily milk production is less than 12 liters. Some use 7 liters as the benchmark. So there are different benchmarks used by different farming systems, right? But usually, if it's giving as much as 12 liters, you can't expect to dry them off suddenly and for them to produce no milk tomorrow, right? So if you do that, there will be leakage from the teats, and that is not a good thing, because when there is leakage, the teat canal stays open. So if milk can come out, bacteria can go in and cause mastitis, right? So that is not good if the milk production is still high, right? So another bad practices in Sri Lanka is in such cows, farmers keep on, milking out partially. So the idea is to reduce the pressure inside the udder. But when you do that, you remove not only milk, but you are also removing the negative feedback inhibition that is caused by the accumulating milk. So when that negative feedback inhibition is removed, animal keeps on producing more milk, right? That is not good, right? So abrupt drying off is the best if the animal's daily milk production has already come down, preferably to less than 6-7 liters a day, right? However, it can be a problem if the milk yield is high. As I said, milk will be leaking out, bacteria will be leaking in, right? So if your animal is still a very high producer, as I mentioned earlier, first you switch to once a day milking. By doing that, again, you're giving the message to the eating cells, okay, we are not going to remove milk, because if you remove milk, that negative feedback inhibition is there. So by causing milk to remain inside the udder, it exerts some kind of a negative feedback inhibition, which stimulates the cells to reduce their production, right? So that way, gradually over a week or two, the milk yield will come down to that 6-7 liters you want by the time of 305 days, right? So another thing we can do is we can limit the energy input, right? So you might recall it is the propionate that undergoes gluconeogenesis, and then which turns into lactose, which has an osmotic effect which draws in water to give the large volume, right? So it works the other way around also. If you can restrict propionate or energy highly soluble carbohydrate, as restrict that, no propionate, no gluconeogenesis, no lactose or less lactose, and less osmosis, less volume, right? So that is what you're trying to do here. Depending on how big of a producer this one is, you can decrease large quantity or small quantity, or even entirely stop concentrates gradually, right? You have 2 weeks to play with. And then, so now this does not mean you starve the animal. You don't limit quantity, right? Because the animal will be hungry. So that's not good on the one hand, because of animal welfare things. We shouldn't keep animals hungry. And on the other hand, it will be a stress to the animal, because yesterday I ate 20 kilograms and today I'm getting 5 kilograms, right? So that be a stress to the animal, which can predispose it for different disease situations. So you don't want to limit the quantity. Instead, what you do is you limit the quality, right? So you give the same quantity, but you give low quality feed. This is where you would give forages which are low to moderate quality. You might even consider including straw for extreme high producers to bring their production down, right? Like I said, moderate producers, you can start this process maybe 1 week ahead of the 305-day schedule. But if it's like a 25-30 liter animal, still giving 20 liters of milk by 290 days, you might want to start this process as early as 2 weeks prior to drying off. Right? So basically two things. One is once a day milking, the other one is restriction of energy. Right, and that should do the trick. By the time of 305 days, daily milk production would have gone down to about 6-7 liters a day. Right, so there's a slide I took from this URL. I'll be showing several slides that I from this URL. They've done such a good job. I thought there is no need for me to redo it. So it talks about the same thing. Abrupt cessation, making, go through this. Here they mentioned two terms that we have not done yet. We'll be covering in the next two slides. This stands for dry cow therapy, with or without Teat sealant. So we'll talk about that. So this is what I mentioned about 1 to 2 weeks prior to the 305 dry off date. So 1 week before the 98 days, 2 weeks before, 14 days before 305 would be 291, right? So that would depend on the level of production. So eliminate concentrates, energy restrictions. You should not limit water intake, because one of the old practices was to limit the water intake, right? So that way you starve the animal of water. We'll be talking about this under nutrition. Usually we say a cow has to drink 4 to 5 liters of water to produce 1 liter of milk, right? So by limiting water intake, you can actually reduce milk production, but in a welfare aspect and health aspect, that is not recommended nowadays. So if you do the restriction of concentration, you can avoid using this bad practice, right? And intermittent milking, like I mentioned earlier, right? So these practices can reduce as much as 47%, right? And it also accelerates involution, reducing chances of new intra-mammary infections at calving, right? Okay, so this chart, right, shows the intramammary infection rate reduction compared to abrupt milking, abrupt drying off. Remember I said when you do abrupt drying off, unless the milk yield is really low, there can be milk leakage, right? So if milk can come out, bacteria can go in to cause mastitis, right? So therefore, if I ask you which type causes most intramammary infections, the answer is abrupt, right? So compared to abrupt, if you use intermittent milking only without feed restrictions, intramammary infections still go down by 30%. But if you combine intermittent milking together with a ration change, meaning the restriction of concentrate feeds, intramammary new infections can go down by up to 50%. That's a lot, right? So similar thing you can observe with the milk yield also. As I said, some farms use this practice of 12 to 13 liters, right? So if the animal is producing less than 13 kilograms of milk at the time of drying off, intramammary infection rate is about 16% new IMIs, right? Whereas if the animal is producing over 21 liters, infection rate is 25%, right? So you would ideally want this to be less than 13. You still get 16% infections, right? So the lower this number is, the lower this number would be. If you do your management properly, you can reduce this by restriction and intermittent milking and remove the chances of intramammary infections as much as possible, reduce. Right. So we talked about dry cow therapy and teat sealant, right? So now, what is the actual drying off process, right? So on the day of drying off, so which would ideally be the 305th day of lactation, right? So you milk out all 4 quarters, right? Completely as much as possible, and then you infuse the dry cow therapy to all 4 quarters, right? So dry cow therapy is one thing, and the other one is lactation cow therapy, which is what we give when animals get mastitis during the lactation period, right? So these are two different preparations. You cannot give uh, intramammary infusions meant for use during the lactation period in the dry period. You cannot use. There are separate preparations for dry period and drying off and lactation period, right? And then once you do that, you can do a teat sealant and seal off. Do you think this is an intramammary infusion or teat sealant? This is a radiograph. As a intramammary infusion, dry cow therapy is supposed to go all the way up to the mammary gland. So these are teat sealant. It stays inside the teat only. When you infuse them, you have to infuse it slowly so that it doesn't spill into the udder, right? If it spills into the udder, when you start milking the animal will be you will find the teat sealant material in milk for a few days, right? But whereas if you keep it inside the teat, right at the first milking, you can remove this teat sealant and milk won't have the sealant anymore, right? Now, most people just stop here, right, without dry cow therapy or teat sealant. So ideally, you want to give both of these if the finances allow. But different studies have shown that use of teat sealants and dry cow therapy, although they are an additional expenditure, in the long run, it saves money that the farmer has to spend for treating mastitis cases. Right? Now, I want you to refer about dry cow therapy and teat sealants. So there are different ways of applying them. some farms do blanket infusions, meaning all 4 quarters of all animals that are being dried will get dry cow therapy and teeth sealants, right? So that is one approach where you don't consider the cost, right? And then another approach would be to give dry cow therapy only, or to give teeth sealants only, again blanket, right? Or another approach is to identify the problem animals and give them. Or you can be even more conservative and give these to only the affected quarters, right? And some people do dry cow therapy to all 4 quarters, but teeth sealants to only some. So there are different ways people recommend this, and a lot of studies done to look at the different options. So I want you to do some references and find out what is practiced in different parts of the world and what is suitable for the Sri Lankan situation. Right? And also what is being practiced in Sri Lanka. Certain provinces, they provide dry cow therapy to farmers free of charge or at a subsidized price. Right? Find out about that also, right? So now most people would stop there, but ideally you want to do teat dipping, right? So remember now, until as long as the milking was going on, right? So there was pre-dipping, post-dipping, once, twice, or thrice a day, right? So the moment you dry off, a lot of people don't do this dipping anymore because in theory, animal doesn't produce milk, so why dip, right? But however, it's a good idea to do that, especially if you have to do abrupt milking. There is a chance of milk leakage and teat canal opening. So anyway, teat canal won't, if you didn't use teat sealant, right, teat canal will remain open to a certain degree, certain number of days. So it's a good idea to do this. Can you think of a reason why teat dipping can be a bad idea sometimes? Right, so teat dipping can be a bad idea if you do it improperly. Take the animals to their milking parlor, right? Remember the milk ejection reflex, right? So when the animal sees the milking parlor, when the animal sees other animals being milked, right? It stimulates the milk let down, right? So also by touching the teeth, touching the udder, dipping, all these can remind the animal of the experiences at the milking parlor and cause milk let down. So that is not good, right? So other than that, so that's why you shouldn't take it to the milking parlor. You can just do it at the barn where the animal is, right? Use a different teat dip cup, right? So that way it's different. It doesn't evoke memories of the milking parlor, right? And so you have to observe them during that first week until involution sets in. If you see any signs of mastitis, basically the fundamentals, red hot painful swelling, you see any of those, you have to tend immediately, right? So you have to keep them under observation during that first week. And of course, you want clean, dry, well-bedded environment, basic diagnosis, and like I said, away from the milking cows and milking parlor, and also don't send them for long walks during this first week, because all of those can stimulate, and also they can predispose the animal for dirty in their teeth, which can predispose to mastitis, right? Right. Okay. So now think about this for a second, right? So you're applying the dry cow therapy or teat sealant from the side of the cow, right? You don't do this you don't come from the behind and do it between the legs, right? So let's say you approach the animal from the left side, right? So you have to first clean the teat ends, right, before you infuse dry cow therapy, right? So you milk the animals completely, right? And then how do you clean them and treat them? So the term we are using here is the far side and the near side, right? So you have, so you're approaching from the left side, right? If you're approaching from the left side of the cow, you have the left fore teat or quarter and left rear teat as the near side, on the near side, and on the far side you have the right forequarter and the right hind quarter, right? So which one do you clean first? Is it the near side or the far side, right? So if you answered far side, you got it right, because if you clean the near side first, when you secondly clean the far side, you can contaminate the near side ones, right, which are already clean. So you don't want to do that. You want to first clean the far side and then come to the near side of the other. So in this example, it would be the right side ones first, then the left side one. Right, but then when you infuse dry cow therapy or teat sealant, now it's the other way around. Now if you do the far side first, right? Okay, so they are clean, but while you do that, you might touch the near side, right? So then they are not clean anymore. Right? So that's why when you infuse, so when you clean, you do the far side first and near side second. But when you infuse, you do the near side first. Okay, now they are sealed and infused, and then you move down to the far side. Right? So left first, right second. Okay, I hope that is clear. Right. So another important tip is, of course, you learn this when you're in the ambulatory profession or in the clinics, right? Is that you don't insert the whole length of the infusion. You want to try to keep it to the teat canal, right? Which is that you don't want the tip of the infusion all the way coming in to the teat, right? So you want to try to keep it here, which is a few millimeters, right? And of course, then for dry cow therapy, one tube is for 1/4. You don't want to be stingy and use half a tube. You have to insert the whole tube. This is true for dry cow therapy or lactation cow therapy, right? And then you massage the treatment up into each corner. Now remember, this is for dry cow therapy only. For teat sealant, you do not massage the treatment up into the quarter, right? For teat sealant, you want to keep it within the teat. So you infuse really slowly, because if you press rapidly, it will get into the mammary gland, right? So you want to keep it very slow and steady and restrict it to the teat, right? And then, like I said earlier, immediately following treatment, you have to dip all teats in a recommended teat dip, right? So this is what I talked about. Read this, right? In the teat end, see the far side ones first when you're cleaning, and when you're treating, near side ones first, far side ones later, and then the dip, right? Okay, so when you're doing teat sealant, right, so you want to press and block off the teat, so that way you can keep it within the teat without it going into the other, right, mammary gland. But when you're doing DCT, trichotherapy, that's not the way you do. You don't block here. Let it go all the way. In fact, you massage upwards and encourage infusion of this into the mammary gland. Right. So dry cow therapy, as you can see here, so this is lactation therapy, this is drying off therapy. for all these organisms, the response rate is much higher than in case of lactation therapy. That is 60% versus 26, 99, 85, 96, 90, 87, 77. Some of them not too different, some of them very different. All yes, right? What it shows is that it is more effective. Why is it more effective? Because in case of lactation cow therapy, right, it will come out with, it gets diluted, it comes out when being milked out, right? But dry cow therapy stays inside the udder, right? There's milk production is low or none, and then on the other hand, it is not being removed, right? So basically, dry cow therapy has two functions. One is if there are existing infections, it will help cure them, and on the other hand, it will help prevent new infections. Right? Okay, so this is what I talked about earlier. Compress the area at the base of the teat. Insert cannula using the partial insertion. Remember I said do not insert this whole length, right? If you insert the whole length, it will be here and it will spill on to the mammary gland, right? And then you slowly infuse contents, right? All simple things, right? Okay, so these are two leading brands in the Western world, right? So you need to know what's inside there, what's the main component. It's either bismuth or paraffin based, right? And it gets removed at the first. The idea is to seal off the teat canal. Right? So this is that milk infection reflex that I told you about. Touching on this thing. Remember I said dipping can stimulate or the milking parlor site of calves, right? So you have to avoid these during that first week, right? Otherwise, it will stimulate milk production and your drying off won't be successful. Right, so I want you to go through these questions so that we can attend to them in the class, right? So it's really important that you go through these questions because I usually give a similar question during the exam. A lot of people don't do too well, so you won't get the same question, but you'll get a similar question. To be able to face that question, it is important that you go through this practice question. Okay, right. So like I said earlier, generally 45 to 60 days, 60 days for heifers and 40 to 50 days, 40 to 45 for multiparous cows for the reasons I explained earlier. So you need this rest period so that can affect the mammary cell proliferation and mammary function in the subsequent lactation so that milk production can be optimized. Otherwise, you will get a lower level of milk, as I showed in that using those charts and tables, right? So the physiology can be divided into three phases. Right? So one is the active involution. The first starts from the first day till about 3 to 4 weeks, and then there is a steady state involution. After this until 3 to 4 weeks prior to parturition, depending on how long the dry period is. 60 days is how many weeks? It's about 8 weeks, right? 7 times 8, 56. So the first 3 to 4 weeks and the middle 3 to 4 weeks, let's say 3 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and so usually that's when cholesteatogenesis starts, right? So depending on how much of a period you give it, right, these periods can change. Right, so during the active involution phase, the initial phase, you have milk stasis, udder distension, increased intra-alveolar pressure, which exerts that negative feedback inhibition that I talked about. So really basic things. I'm not going to spend time on this. You should read by yourself and try to understand these, right? The different things that takes place during that first phase and the last phase, right? So it has been shown, right? Right. So in a cow given a 60-day dry period, they have shown that DNA synthesis increases starting around 35 days prepartum, right? So what does that mean? DNA synthesis increases. What does that mean? Cells are proliferating, right? So alveolar cells that were dormant, right, by involution starting to double up or starting to divide themselves and getting ready for next lactation, right? So that is when you assume colostrogenesis starts, right? And of course antibodies and all that, right, being secreted for colostrum, right? So this is again information you should know, what happens during the 3 phases, right? So go through that, you'll see that these leukocytes, lactoferrins, immunoglobulins, they have a role in fighting against infections, controlling bacteria, right? So that's why they are increasing, whereas milk components are decreasing, they are increasing at the end, right? So study this table, right? So a lot of people think, right, that susceptibility to new infections is highest at calving, but that is not correct, right? So clinical mastitis you see at calving. However, new infections take place soon after drying off because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, right? So you have to keep that in mind, and that is why dry cow therapy is so important, right? Go through this, right? So these are acquired at dry off and they become clinical at calving. Right? So that is very important. This is where the new infections take place. Same thing shown here. So it's contagious mastitis, right? So contagious mastitis, early lactation is when that happens, right? But environmental mastitis, quite usually during this phase. Right? So there are 2 types of mastitis which you will learn later. Contagious mastitis, which is infectious from animal to animal, and environmental mastitis, and infections obtained from the environment. So study this and you will understand, right? So why are animals so susceptible to mastitis infections at drying off or dry period? Because lactation, milk is periodically removed, right? So if any bacteria go in, bacteria also get removed, right? And there's no medium for bacteria to grow. But here, milk is retained inside the udder, which is an excellent growth for bacteria, and it won't get removed, right? And people discontinue it and disinfection. Again, allows bacteria to colonize at the teat tip and to go in, right? So although there are leukocytes, they are busy with breaking down milk fat, casein, cell debris, etc., and so their phagocytic function goes down a little, right? So antibodies are increasing but low at the beginning of the dry cow period, right? So that is where if PCT is given, right, it can be really effective, right? So I talked about lactoferrin briefly, iron binding function, and then there is also a keratin plug that forms naturally at the teat end. So please do read up about that. What does this consist of? Does it have static bacterial antibacterial effects? So read up on that. You will be questioned, right? So that is the keratin plug talked about. Right, so obviously comes with greater milk yield and dry off, leak milk, and predisposed problems. Right, so research has shown that as much as 50% of cows had open and therefore leaky teat ends even 1 week after dry off. Right, so after 6 weeks, still 23% cows had open teat ends. Right, so this is why it is really important to practice these things, right? Proper, reduction of the volume, intermittent milking, restriction of energy, teat sealant, and practicing, staying away, no stimuli, staying away from stimulating the milk let down, right? So that is why all those are important. And so basically, there is a 5-point plan to control mastitis. This is very basic, right? You can elaborate this to, for a 3-hour lecture, just the mastitis control, right? So national mastitis control, right? So one of the major points during lactation is post-milking teat disinfection. After milking, teat end can remain open, right? So comprehensive dry cow therapy, drying off, clinical therapy of clinical cases during lactation, proper milking machine maintenance, and of course culling problem cow, because there are certain cows, however much you treat, they go on to keep these, right? Because of the anatomy or whatever, bacteria can lodge inside, and they just don't go away, right? So by keeping such animals in your herd, you're just, you just don't get rid of the problem. Right? So culling problem manuals is really important. Right. So this I got from Dilaver. So you heard of this Dilaver? Uh, one of the leading producers or manufacturers of dairy-related things, right? Got from their website. And so this talks about some KPIs, right? Performance indicators. You've heard of KPIs, right? And so these are the numbers your targets should be, right? You can't expect to have 0 mastitis, right, in a herd, but then shouldn't be more than 2%, right? You have to aim for less than 2%. Somatic cell count in the bulk tank, it won't be 0, right? But you should target for something like this. This is not good. Cull rate, cull rate, we typically say 25 to 30% annually needs to be culled, but culling for other health reasons should be less than 5%, right? So I have not gone into this yet, right? But I'll give you some handouts for you to just to get an idea. There is a system of scoring the teat ends, right? 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So also a cow signal kind of, right? So if you have more than 10 or 15% of cows with score of 3 and 4, that is not good. The majority should be 1 and 2. Right? The majority should be 1 and 2. Again, if it's less than 30%, that's not good. Okay. Another slide from the same website, right? So these are, again, we talked about the 5 points of NMC, National Mastitis Control Plan, and these are similar things to somatic cell count. And so you need to minimize the bacterial number on the teat, prevent them from attaching, and prevent them from entering. So very simple. Minimize the number of bacteria on the teat, prevent them from attaching and growing, and then prevent them entering. Right. These are the simple things that can, the farmers, right? Yeah, they can make a difference at the field level. Okay, guys, that is all for the dry cow management lecture. And I'll see you again for transition cow management in the next lecture.